The Black Mozart of Paris. The crisp Parisian air of 1785 hummed with a tension that had little to do with the looming revolution and everything to do with the man standing on the velvet-draped stage of the Palais Royal. He was grace personified, a titan in tailored silk, his skin the color of rich mahogany, a stark and beautiful contrast to the powdered wigs and pale faces of the aristocracy that filled every seat. In one hand he held a violin, a Stradivarius that seemed an extension of his arm. In the other, a dueling sword, its steel tip gleaming under the chandeliers. He was Joseph Bologne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and tonight he was about to prove a point. Across from him stood the renowned fencing master, the Chevalier d'Eon, a man who was himself a legend, a spy who had lived half his life as a woman. The wager was simple, the stakes impossibly high, a musical duel followed by a clash of swords. The city of Paris held its breath. Who was this man who could command both a concert hall and dueling piece with equal breathtaking mastery? He was the son of a slave, the greatest swordsman in Europe, a celebrated composer, a violin virtuoso, and a military hero. And his story was more unbelievable than any fiction. Chapter 1. The Sugar-Coated Cage. The island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean was a world forged from two opposing forces, staggering beauty and unspeakable cruelty. Emerald green volcanic peaks clawed at a sky of impossible blue, while fields of sugarcane stretched to the horizon, their sweet scent a constant, cloying perfume on the humid air. It was a place of vibrant hibiscus flowers and iridescent hummingbirds, and it was a place of chains, whips, and human beings treated as chattel. In this brutal paradise, in the year 1745, a story began that would defy every rule of the 18th century world. The source of this story was an unlikely union. Georges Bologne was a wealthy French plantation owner, a man of minor nobility, who, like many of his peers, had a calculated pragmatism about his life in the colonies. He had a legitimate wait wife back in France, a marriage of convenience and social standing. But here, in the simmering heat of his plantation, his heart and his home belonged to Nanon, a beautiful woman of Senegalese origin. Nanon was his property, his slave. Under the monstrous laws of the Code Noir that governed the French colonies, she was not a person, but a thing, a movable asset. Yet the relationship between Georges and Nanon was one of genuine and deep affection, a quiet rebellion against the society they inhabited. Nanon was not just a concubine, she was the mistress of the plantation household, a position of paradoxical power. It was into this complex, love-filled, yet fundamentally unjust world that their son was born. They named him Joseph. From his first breath, he was a contradiction. He was the son of a nobleman, yet he inherited his mother's legal status. He was a slave. By law, he could be sold, beaten, or even killed at his own father's whim. But Georges Bologne had no such intentions. He adored his son with a fierce, protective love that transcended law and custom. Joseph was raised not in the slave quarters, but in the main house. He was not put to work in the cane fields. He was given tutors. He learned to read and write, to understand mathematics and literature, but his true education came from the island itself. He learned to ride horses like a native islander, with a fearless, intuitive grace. He swam in the turquoise waters, his body growing strong and agile. And he learned about music, not the refined minuets of the French court, but the complex, polyrhythmic heartbeat of his mother's heritage, the songs of Africa that had survived the horrors of the Middle Passage. These sounds mingled with the formal European melodies his tutors played on the harpsichord, creating a unique symphony in his young mind. His world was a gilded cage. He was surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege, yet the single, unchangeable fact of his mother's bloodline meant that he was never truly free. He saw the casual brutality meted out to the other enslaved people, people who looked like his mother, like himself. He understood, with a clarity that sharpened as he grew, that his father's love was a fragile shield against a world that saw him as less than human. This fragile existence was shattered when Joseph was 7 years old. In a fit of jealous rage or political maneuvering, the records are unclear, a rival plantation owner accused Georges Bologne of a crime. The accusation was flimsy, but in the viper nest of colonial politics, it was enough to damn him. Georges was forced to flee Guadeloupe, to escape to France and clear his name. He could not take Nanon or Joseph with him. To do so would have admitted his crime of cohabitation and to risk them being seized. For 2 years, Joseph and his mother lived in a state of terrifying uncertainty. They were still legally the property of Georges Bologne, but with their protector an ocean away, their status was precarious. Nanon, with quiet strength and dignity, navigated the treacherous social landscape, shielding her son as best she could. It was during this period that the boy learned his most important lesson, that his life was a performance. To survive, he had to be better, faster, smarter, and more charming than anyone else. He had to make himself indispensable, unforgettable. Finally, word came. Georges Bologne had been exonerated. He was returning, not just to reclaim his property, but to do something radical, something that would set the course for his son's rest of life. He was not content for Joseph to live out his days in the ambiguous half-world of a privileged slave. He had a vision for his son, a vision of greatness that would transcend the color of his skin. In 1753, Georges Bologne sold his plantation, gathered Nanon and his 8-year-old son, and boarded a ship bound for France. As the shores of Guadeloupe receded, Joseph was leaving behind the only home he had ever known. He was sailing towards the heart of the most sophisticated, powerful, and racially stratified society in the world. He was no longer a slave boy on a remote island. He was about to become a Parisian. The cage had been opened, but he was flying into a forest full of unseen traps and predators, armed with nothing but a fierce will to succeed and a talent that was still a slumbering giant within him. Paris awaited, a city of light and shadow, ready to test him in ways he could not yet imagine. Paris was not a city, it was a universe. For a boy whose world had been the green and blue expanse of a Caribbean island, the arrival was a sensory assault. The river Seine was not a sparkling turquoise sea, but a murky, slate-gray artery, teeming with barges and choked with the city's refuse. The air, thick with the smells of coal smoke, baking bread, and unwashed humanity, was a world away from the floral, salty breezes of Guadeloupe. The buildings, immense monuments of stone, leaned in over narrow cobblestone streets, blotting out the sun in a way that felt both magnificent and menacing. Georges Bologne secured a lavish apartment in the Saint-Germain district, a neighborhood of aristocratic townhouses and intellectual salons. His strategy was immediate and clear. If French society was a fortress, he would not have his son storm the walls. He would give him the keys. Joseph was to be educated not merely as a gentleman, but as an exemplary one. His accomplishments would have to be so dazzling that they would blind society to his origins. The first key was the sword. In 18th century France, the right to carry a sword
The second key was music. If the sword was to be his shield and his weapon in society, music would be his soul and his passport into its heart, the salons. George hired the finest tutors, and a violin was placed in Joseph's hands. At first, the instrument was an alien thing, a stubborn wooden box that produced screeching sounds under his inexpert fingers. The discipline was torturous, far removed from the intuitive rhythms of his childhood. Yet here, too, something extraordinary began to happen. The formal structure of European classical music began to merge with the complex melodies he remembered from his mother's songs. He possessed what musicians call perfect pitch, the rare ability to identify and recreate a musical note without any reference tone. His progress was astonishing. Within a few years, he was not just playing the violin, he was making it sing. His teachers, like his fencing master, were stunned. They had been hired to teach a wealthy colonial son a polite pastime. They found themselves shaping a prodigy. His life became a grueling, meticulously planned regimen. Mornings were for academia, mathematics, literature, history. Afternoons were for the clang of steel in the salle d'armes. Evenings were for the delicate, demanding work of scales and sonatas on the violin. Through it all, his father watched, encouraging and demanding. George Bologna was molding his son into a new kind of man, a Renaissance man of the Enlightenment, whose catalogue of talents would be his armor against the prejudices of the world. One afternoon at the fencing academy, a young, arrogant baron, tired of being bested by Joseph, threw down his foil in frustration. "I will not be made a fool of by a mulatto," he sneered, the slur loud enough for the whole hall to hear. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Joseph. This was the moment his father had been preparing him for. He could challenge the baron to a duel, but that would be a rash, dangerous move. Instead, Joseph simply picked up the baron's foil from the floor. He tested his weight, checked his balance, and then offered it back to him, hilt first. "Your form is improving, Baron," Joseph said, his voice calm and even, devoid of any anger. "But your lunge is still too slow. Shall we try again?" The response was a masterstroke of psychological dominance. He had not answered the insult. He had dismissed it as irrelevant.